I don't have much, but I can share what I do, Jamal whispered to the night as he shuffled down the rain-slick sidewalk, his thin hoodie clinging to his shoulders and the frayed ends of his sneakers squelching with every step through puddles reflecting the dim streetlights above. He paused near the corner of 5th and Pine, where the alley narrowed and shadows pooled like ink, and that's when he saw him, a man lying motionless on the cold asphalt, an old military watch glinting faintly under the flickering light of a broken street lamp. Jamal's breath puffed in front of him, short and shallow, as he crouched beside the man, feeling the pulse of the city around them fade to a quiet hum, only the distant wail of a siren threading through the misty drizzle. People passed without a glance, umbrellas raised high, heels splashing, cars rolling past without a pause, yet Jamal's eyes stayed fixed on the still figure, his hands trembling slightly as he unzipped his backpack, pulling out a small bottle of water and a crumpled blanket he had scavenged earlier that day. Kneeling down, he adjusted the man's jacket, laying the blanket over him, and muttered quietly, almost to himself, "Just breathe, all right? Just breathe." The rain dampened his hair, ran down the sides of his face, but he didn't move, didn't flinch. The chill in the air seeped through his thin layers, pinching at his arms and legs, yet he stayed there, his small frame a quiet barrier against the cold night. The smell of wet asphalt and the faint tang of nearby trash mixed with the crisp scent of rain, sharp and electric. Jamal's fingers found the man's wrist, checking for a pulse he already knew he couldn't see, feeling the rhythm of life that was weak but present, a subtle thrum against the pads of his fingertips. He glanced around. No one stopped, no one questioned, no one offered help or even a glance, but he didn't waver. His focus was absolute, a single thread binding him to the responsibility he had chosen. He straightened slightly, looking at the face of the unconscious man, noting the salt and pepper hair, the lines carved deep from years of decisions and experiences, and whispered again, "I've got you," as though speaking aloud could anchor the stranger back to life. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant chatter of a late-night diner, the hum of a bus idling a block away, the rustle of trash bins tipping in the alley, and Jamal pressed the blanket more snugly around the man's shoulders, offering what little warmth he could provide. Minutes stretched, a quiet eternity measured in breaths and drops of rain sliding down the edges of the crumpled cardboard and puddles pooling around the scene. He crouched closer, scanning the face for any sign, any flicker of awareness, his own heartbeat loud in his ears, a drumbeat of determination against the indifference of the city. A car's headlights cut through the mist briefly, casting a fleeting glow across the alley, illuminating Jamal's youthful face and the man beneath the blanket, emphasizing the vulnerability of both, yet the boy remained steadfast. "Hang on," he whispered, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of empathy far beyond his years. The night seemed to respond, quieting further, as if holding its breath alongside him, every puddle and brick wall reflecting the solemn commitment in his gaze. He held the man's hand gently, shifting slightly to keep him comfortable, adjusting the blanket so it didn't slip, listening to the faint distant sounds of the city, the occasional dog barking far away, the rhythmic drip of water from a gutter above, all blending into a symphony of vigilance and patience. Jamal's eyes flicked to the watch on the man's wrist again, catching the faint glint of metal and thinking fleetingly of the life it represented, a life suspended in a moment only he had chosen to honor. And as he leaned forward slightly, the cold seeping into his bones, he murmured, "I don't know who you are, but I'm not leaving you here." His words merging with the rain and the darkness, a promise that the night would hold them both until help came, a silent guardian in a world that had turned its eyes away. The night had stretched longer than Jamal realized, the alley now quieter with only the occasional car passing blocks away, tires hissing over wet pavement, and the distant clatter of a delivery truck folding into the hum of the city. He stayed crouched beside the man, listening to the steady drip of rain from the broken streetlight above, counting each droplet as though it marked time and purpose. Jamal's fingers adjusted the blanket again, tucking it snugly under the man's shoulders, careful not to wake him or cause discomfort, while the cold seeped through his worn layers, chilling him to the bone. He glanced toward the sidewalk, where puddles reflected the dull glow of the neon sign from a closed diner across the street, the light rippling with every ripple of water as if the city itself were breathing in unison with him. Around him, the sounds of the urban night blended together, the low hum of a passing bus, the faint bark of a distant dog, the whisper of wind curling around the corners of buildings, and Jamal drew a slow breath, steadying himself, feeling the rhythm of the night become his own. He checked the man's pulse once more, pressing lightly against the wrist, counting the beats, noting the faint thrum that confirmed life still lingered there. The man's eyes twitched slightly beneath his eyelids, and Jamal leaned in closer, whispering encouragements under the breath. "You are safe now. I will not leave." His words hung softly in the misty air, carried only by the rain and the dim light of the street lamp. A few blocks away, the sound of footsteps approached, but Jamal remained perfectly still, alert but undistracted, his attention entirely on the responsibility he had taken upon himself. The chill bit into his fingers and toes, but he did not move to seek warmth. His heart and focus were tethered to the man he had found, the quiet sense of duty stronger than any discomfort. Occasionally, he adjusted the man's head slightly, tilting it to prevent choking, and smoothed the blanket over his legs, careful to preserve the minimal warmth against the cold concrete beneath. The glow of a distant building reflected faintly off the puddles, casting shadows that danced across the walls, adding depth to the silence that had settled, almost sacred in its intensity. Jamal's eyes scanned the alley again, seeing only empty streets and darkened windows, and yet he felt a silent presence, a reassurance born not from others but from his own unwavering choice to stay. Time passed slowly, measured not by minutes but by the careful movements of his hands, the shallow breaths of the man beside him, and the subtle sounds of life continuing around the city without noticing the act of care unfolding in a small forgotten corner. Jamal's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw set with determination, his back straight as he shifted slightly to rest his weight evenly, refusing to falter despite fatigue and the deep, penetrating cold. The alley smelled faintly of wet brick and asphalt, tinged with the scent of rain and the distant aroma of a bakery closing for the night, and it mingled with the tactile sensation of the damp cardboard beneath him. Every sound, every reflection, every shiver reminded him of the responsibility he carried and the silent commitment he had made. To be present, to watch, to protect. And so he stayed, hour after hour, until a distant siren pierced the night, distant but growing nearer, signaling that help was approaching. Jamal's heart quickened, not from fear but from relief, his fingers still gently resting on the man's wrist, willing him to hold on a little longer, to remain steady, to endure until the world finally acknowledged the fragility and courage of the quiet act that had unfolded in the shadows. The flashing red and white lights of the ambulance bathed the alley in a surreal glow, reflections bouncing off puddles and the wet asphalt like scattered fragments of a broken neon sign, and Jamal crouched a little further back, hands pressed into the damp cardboard beneath him, watching as paramedics carefully lifted the man onto a stretcher, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders and checking the oxygen mask over his face. The wind had picked up, rustling the edges of nearby trash bins and sending a soft clatter echoing down the narrow street, and the rain had slowed to a fine drizzle that trickled from the gutters, adding a gentle rhythm to the otherwise hushed scene. Jamal's heart thudded in his chest, not from fear, but from a mixture of relief and anticipation, as though every beat carried the weight of his choice to stay and watch over the man despite the cold and the dark and the indifference of the world around them. He shifted slightly to give himself a clearer view, noting the subtle details of the paramedics' movements, the careful lift of the stretcher, the adjustment of straps and sheets, the quiet murmurs as they confirmed vitals and stability, each gesture precise and methodical, as though they were performing a silent choreography in the dim light. As the doors of the ambulance opened, Jamal instinctively stepped forward, not wanting to be in the way but compelled to ensure the man's safety, his fingers brushing the edge of the stretcher for reassurance before letting go. He watched as the paramedics wheeled the man into the back, the siren now a steady wail cutting through the night, and he could feel the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction, knowing that the stranger he had found was finally in capable hands. The alley around him seemed to exhale, the city resuming its subtle rhythm, distant honks and murmurs of late-night travelers blending with the patter of the drizzle on rooftops and the soft rustle of leaves along the sidewalk. Jamal pulled the blanket tighter around himself, the damp fabric sticking to his hoodie, and took a slow, measured breath, allowing the warmth of the small victory to settle into his chest, the faint ache of cold still present but tempered by the satisfaction of having done what was right without expectation or reward. He scanned the empty street one more time, taking in the muted glow of streetlights, the reflections in the puddles, and the silent buildings that loomed over him, feeling simultaneously small and significant in the quiet of the night. The distant echo of the ambulance receded, leaving a profound stillness, and Jamal allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, thinking about the fragility of life and the strength it takes to offer care without recognition. He glanced down at the small belongings he carried, the few meager items that made up his life, and realized that in that moment, the world had not seen him, the city had not noticed him, but his actions had bridged the gap between invisibility and impact, creating a ripple in the quiet darkness. With a careful, steady hand, he adjusted the blanket one final time, tucked his backpack closer to his chest, and settled back against the brick wall of the alley, listening to the soft drip of water from the eaves above, the distant hum of city life, and the steady beat of his own heart, knowing that what had begun as a chance encounter would linger in memory far longer than the rain or the chill of the night. The first rays of dawn began filtering through the low-hanging clouds, casting a pale golden light across the scattered tents in the makeshift encampment where Jamal had spent the night, and he stirred slowly, the dampness of the ground still clinging to his thin clothes as he stretched and rubbed his eyes, noticing how quiet the alley had become except for the occasional distant hum of a delivery truck or the fluttering of a newspaper caught in the breeze. The air carried the sharp scent of wet concrete mixed with the faint aroma of coffee brewing from a nearby corner cafe, and Jamal breathed deeply, savoring the small warmth that came from simply being awake and alone for a moment before the city fully stirred. His gaze drifted to the narrow street, noticing the light reflecting off puddles that had formed in the uneven cracks of asphalt, and he remembered the events of the previous night, the fragile pulse he had felt beneath his fingers, the weight of responsibility he had taken on, and a subtle sense of pride crept into his chest, tempered by the persistent chill that nipped at his skin. He stood slowly, folding the blanket he had wrapped around the man into a neat square, placing it carefully back into his backpack along with the small bottle of water that was nearly empty, and he felt the rough texture of the cardboard beneath his fingers, remembering how it had served as both seat and shield through the night. The sound of his own breathing mixed with the distant footsteps of early commuters, their sneakers squeaking lightly against the damp pavement, and the soft clatter of a trash can lid that had been nudged by the wind reminded him that life went on. Around him, unaware of the quiet act of care that had taken place only hours before. Jamal adjusted the strap of his backpack and began walking slowly toward the edge of the encampment, his eyes scanning the familiar walls and corners for any sign of disruption or the presence of others, but all was still as the city awoke gradually, sunlight reflecting off the wet surfaces and casting long, soft shadows. His stomach growled faintly, a reminder that food had been scarce, yet he pushed the thought aside, focusing on the satisfaction of having done the right thing, the echo of the man's faint heartbeat last night still lingering in his mind like a steady, reassuring drum. As he moved toward the main street, Jamal's ears caught the subtle sound of a distant vehicle engine, low and deliberate, and he paused, glancing down the road, noting the sleek shape of a black SUV creeping into view, its headlights reflecting off the damp asphalt, illuminating the edges of the nearby buildings and the scattered litter along the curb. He instinctively ducked slightly, adjusting the hood over his head, yet curiosity drew him to watch as the vehicle slowed, the tires hissing lightly over puddles, and he felt a small, familiar tension, the kind that arises when the unknown approaches, blending caution with a quiet anticipation. The SUV rolled to a stop a short distance from his tent, the engine idling, the faint smell of gasoline mixing with the morning air, and Jamal remained still, his hands tucked inside his sleeves to keep warm, heart beating steadily but alert. From the tinted windows, a subtle movement caught his attention, figures stepping out in a measured, precise manner, the sound of boots on asphalt crisp and deliberate, and Jamal realized instinctively that these were not ordinary passers-by or city workers, their posture and coordination marking them as disciplined and purposeful. A mix of apprehension and intrigue filled him, yet he remained in place, watching as they approached in silence, careful not to startle him, and he felt the weight of the previous night's actions settling into a new dimension, understanding that the consequences of his quiet choice were beginning to unfold in a way that neither he nor anyone else could have anticipated. The sun climbed slightly higher, casting longer shadows across the alley and tents, highlighting the damp textures of tarps and the frayed edges of makeshift structures. As the figures moved closer, their synchronized steps echoing softly, punctuating the morning with the arrival of unexpected authority, and Jamal held his breath, feeling simultaneously small and significant, aware that this moment marked the beginning of a chain of events far beyond the ordinary rhythm of his daily life. silent acknowledgement that the world had finally taken notice of the courage he had quietly shown. The figures in the black SUVs moved with quiet precision, boots pressing against the wet asphalt in unison, their presence commanding the alley without a word, and Jamal felt his pulse quicken, not out of fear, but from the realization that this was far beyond ordinary intervention. He stood adjusting the strap of his backpack over his shoulder, eyes tracing the synchronized steps as the group approached the edge of his small tent, the morning sun casting a muted glow over the scene, illuminating the glistening rain droplets on his hoodie and the folds of the worn blanket beneath his arm. The lead figure, tall and deliberate, paused a few feet from him, tilting his head slightly, observing Jamal with a calm scrutiny that suggested recognition rather than judgment, and for the first time that morning Jamal allowed himself a subtle exhale, the weight of anticipation pressing lightly against his chest. Around them, the city had begun to stir, the hum of distant traffic, the soft clatter of shop doors opening, and the murmur of pedestrians making their way through the streets, but the alley remained a bubble of focused attention, each detail crisp and magnified. The way a stray piece of paper fluttered in the light breeze, the faint sheen of moisture on the asphalt, the subtle reflection of the black vehicles in shallow puddles, and the sound of Jamal's own careful footsteps as he shifted slightly to meet the approaching figures. The tall man in front extended a hand slowly, deliberately, and Jamal hesitated only a moment before taking it, feeling the firm grip and the warmth despite the chill that lingered in the air. Another figure, carrying a small, discreet case, nodded toward Jamal and then gestured toward the street, signaling him to follow without urgency, and he realized that this was not a command but an invitation, a recognition of something he had done without expectation or awareness of consequence. As he moved alongside them, the city opening gradually to morning traffic, Jamal's eyes caught glimpses of the others in the group, each maintaining a careful distance yet clearly present, disciplined in posture and measured in motion, like a silent formation moving through the waking world with purpose but without spectacle. The sound of the vehicle's tires against wet pavement created a steady rhythm, punctuating the quiet of the early morning, while the occasional chirp of birds or distant siren reminded him that life continued beyond the alley, indifferent yet intertwined with the small, profound act that had taken place hours before. Jamal's mind wandered briefly to the man he had helped, wondering if he was safe, comfortable, or aware of the attention his small act of care had drawn, and the thought was accompanied by a quiet pride, subtle but resonant, warming him from within despite the dampness clinging to his clothing. As the convoy reached the end of the block, the leader glanced back, making eye contact with Jamal, and in that moment, there was an unspoken acknowledgement, a shared understanding that courage and kindness were recognized even in the absence of status or wealth, and that the choices one makes quietly can ripple far beyond the immediate world. The hum of the city swelled slightly as they moved on, the figures fading into the distance, leaving Jamal standing at the edge of the alley, the morning sun now stronger, reflecting off puddles and casting long, soft shadows, while he adjusted his backpack once more and felt the faint ache of tired muscles, the echo of last night's vigil still in his limbs, and a calm certainty settled over him, quiet but resolute, that his actions had mattered, that the world had noticed, and that the consequences of simple kindness could arrive in ways more profound than he had ever imagined. The morning air had warmed slightly as Jamal made his way from the alley toward the edge of the city park, his backpack snug against his shoulders and the damp fabric of his hoodie clinging lightly to his skin. The sound of children playing in the distance mixed with the hum of early traffic, cars rolling past with tires splashing over wet pavement, and the occasional ringing of a bicycle bell. Yet Jamal felt as if he existed in a separate layer of the morning, the echoes of the night still vivid in his mind. He passed by the familiar benches and worn paths of the park, noting the small droplets of rain still clinging to the leaves of low-hanging branches and the soft shimmer of dew on blades of grass, reflecting the pale sunlight like scattered diamonds. Jamal paused briefly to adjust the strap of his backpack, his gaze falling on a small puddle where his reflection mingled with the sky above, the image of a young boy alone yet quietly resilient staring back at him, and he thought about the man he had helped, wondering if he was truly all right and whether the world outside this quiet corner had begun to notice the quiet courage that had taken place. The distant sound of a hospital siren reminded him of the stretcher and the paramedics from last night, and a subtle smile touched his lips as he realized that the man's life had been sustained in part by his own persistence and care. Moving further along the path, Jamal passed a small playground now empty except for the occasional swing moving gently in the breeze, the chains creaking softly, and he allowed himself a brief moment to consider the simplicity and fragility of life, the small acts that could ripple outward in ways unseen yet profoundly significant. He kept walking, eyes scanning the surroundings with a quiet alertness, noting the faces of the few passers-by, all absorbed in their own routines, unaware of the impact of his night-long vigil. Yet Jamal did not feel invisible. He felt connected, a subtle thread linking him to the city and the countless lives intersecting within it, the ordinary and the extraordinary blending in quiet harmony. The sunlight began to strengthen, glinting off puddles and wet pavement, casting long shadows that stretched across the worn paths and benches, and Jamal slowed his pace slightly, savoring the crisp scent of morning air mixed with faint hints of coffee and freshly cut grass from the nearby streets. He paused near a low stone wall, resting his hands lightly on the cool surface, and reflected on the choice he had made, the responsibility he had taken, and the sense of quiet achievement that had begun to settle in his chest, subtle but insistent. From the distance, the faint rumble of engines approached, low and deliberate, drawing his attention to the edge of the park, where the shape of vehicles moved along the street, each one precise in movement and purpose, and Jamal instinctively stepped to the side, watching as figures in coordinated formation approached, their boots striking the wet asphalt with rhythm, the echo carrying across the open space and drawing a subtle line of anticipation through the still morning. His eyes met the stance and posture of the lead figure, tall and deliberate, surveying the surroundings with a steady, focused gaze that seemed to recognize more than it revealed, and Jamal felt a mixture of apprehension and intrigue, a sense that the quiet act of last night was beginning to unfold into a new chapter far beyond the alley where he had kept watch. The vehicles slowed and stopped at the edge of the park, the engine idling quietly, and the figures moved with deliberate synchronization toward him, careful yet unobtrusive, an unspoken acknowledgement passing through the measured distance between them and Jamal, the first tangible sign that the choices made in solitude could indeed resonate beyond the confines of a single night, touching others and bridging the space between unseen kindness and recognition. The figures stopped several yards away, creating a respectful distance that felt strangely intentional, and for a long moment nobody spoke. The morning breeze drifted through the park, stirring the leaves overhead and carrying the scent of wet grass and fresh coffee from a nearby food truck that had just opened for the day. Jamal stood quietly with both hands gripping the straps of his backpack, his heartbeat steady but noticeable in his chest, while the sunlight filtered through the clouds and painted soft reflections across the damp pavement beneath their feet. The man at the front of the group took a slow step forward. He looked to be in his 50s, broad-shouldered, composed, with silver beginning to show at his temples. His posture carried the kind of confidence that did not need to announce itself. He studied Jamal carefully before speaking in a calm voice. "You were with him last night." It was not a question. Jamal swallowed lightly and nodded. "Yes, sir." The man glanced briefly toward the others before returning his attention to the boy. "You stayed there for hours." Jamal shifted his weight slightly. He needed help. The answer seemed to hang in the air. No explanation. No attempt to sound impressive. Just a simple truth. The man stared at him for another second, then lowered his eyes briefly as if considering something important. Around them, the city continued moving. A bus rolled past at the far end of the street. A jogger crossed an intersection. Somewhere nearby, a delivery truck released its brakes with a sharp hiss. Yet inside that small circle of silence, none of it seemed to matter. "Most people walked past him," the man said quietly. Jamal looked down at the wet pavement. "I saw that. But you stopped." Jamal nodded again. "My mom used to tell me that if someone is hurting and you can help, then you help. Even if nobody sees it." Something changed in the man's expression. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes. The kind that happens when a memory suddenly returns. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then another member of the group stepped forward carrying a tablet. He handed it to the leader, who glanced at the screen before looking back at Jamal. "Do you know who he is?" Jamal shook his head immediately. "No, sir." "Did he tell you his name?" "No, sir." "Did you look through his wallet?" Jamal hesitated. "I found it when he moved. I only checked to see if there was information that could help." The man nodded. Slowly. "And did you take anything?" The question landed softly, but Jamal still felt heat rise into his face. "No, sir." Nothing. No, sir. The leader smiled faintly for the first time. We know. Jamal blinked. Sir. The man handed the tablet back. There was cash. Credit cards. Identification. A watch worth more than most cars. Everything was still there. Jamal looked confused. It wasn't mine. Several members of the group exchanged brief glances. One of them lowered his head slightly as if hiding a smile. The answer seemed to surprise them more than Jamal realized. The wind shifted again. Above them, clouds slowly parted, allowing stronger sunlight to spill across the park. The wet grass sparkled. Water droplets clung to the branches overhead like tiny crystals. The leader folded his hands behind his back. Do you know what happened after the ambulance left? Jamal shook his head. No, sir. He woke up. Jamal's eyes widened slightly. Relief washed across his face so naturally that everyone present noticed it immediately. He did not ask about money. He did not ask about rewards. He did not ask about consequences. His first reaction was relief. The leader noticed that too. His first question was not where he was. Jamal listened carefully. His first question was not what happened. The man paused. His first question was. He stopped for a moment, looking directly into Jamal's eyes. Where is the boy? A strange silence followed. Jamal felt something shift inside his chest. Not fear. Not pride. Something deeper. Something warmer. Across the park, sunlight continued spreading through the morning while the group stood motionless around him. And for the first time since that rainy night began, Jamal realized that the story was far from over. The park seemed to hold its breath as Jamal remained where he was, the morning sunlight gradually intensifying, glinting off puddles and wet patches of asphalt, while the faint aroma of fresh coffee from nearby cafes mixed with the earthy scent of damp grass and soil. The leader of the group took a deliberate step forward. His eyes locked on Jamal with an intensity that made the boy straighten instinctively. Shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, though his heart raced with anticipation rather than fear. Around them, the quiet rustling of leaves in the trees overhead, and the distant hum of early morning traffic created a subtle rhythm that contrasted with the stillness of their immediate circle, emphasizing the significance of the moment. The leader spoke again, voice calm but weighted with authority. We need to know exactly what you saw. Everything that happened last night. Jamal's fingers tightened on the straps of his backpack, and he nodded slowly. I stayed with him the whole night. He was unconscious. I checked his pulse, made sure he was breathing, kept him warm until the ambulance arrived. That is all I did. The man studied him, tilting his head slightly, and Jamal felt the careful assessment behind the gaze, the kind of scrutiny that measured honesty and courage, not age or status. One of the other figures stepped forward with a tablet and handed it to the leader, who scrolled through images and notes with precision, then glanced up at Jamal. Do you know who he is? Jamal shook his head, gaze fixed on the wet pavement beneath his feet. No, sir. And you did not take anything from him? Jamal's lips pressed into a thin line as he shook his head again. Nothing, sir. Just helped. The leader nodded slowly, a faint expression of respect appearing in the corner of his eyes. Good, he said, almost quietly, letting the word hang in the air. The sound of distant footsteps on concrete drew Jamal's attention momentarily, a jogger passing by, the faint rolling hum of a city bus, the flapping of a newspaper caught in the morning breeze, but all seemed subdued, as though the world around them had quieted in recognition of the exchange unfolding. The leader then motioned toward the street beyond the park, indicating that Jamal should walk with them, and the boy obeyed, heart still steady but mind alert to every detail. The synchronized steps of the group, the subtle discipline in their movements, the unspoken coordination that suggested experience and purpose. As they moved, Jamal observed the careful spacing between each figure, the way their eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, and the faint glint of insignia on their uniforms catching the morning light. Each step felt deliberate, the sound of boots striking the damp pavement a measured cadence that echoed softly through the park, and Jamal felt a mixture of awe and calm, understanding that these were individuals who operated with focus and precision far beyond what he had ever experienced. The wind picked up slightly, rustling leaves and brushing against his hoodie, carrying with it the faint scent of rain lingering from the night before, and Jamal drew a slow, steady breath, allowing himself to feel the gravity of the moment without panic or hesitation. He glanced briefly at the surrounding cityscape, noting the gleaming windows of office buildings reflecting the sunlight, the familiar shapes of rooftops and streets, and the realization settled within him that the simple choice to stay with a stranger through the night had set this sequence into motion, linking him to forces and individuals who had moved silently yet decisively to acknowledge and act upon that small, profound kindness. Each step carried him further into a narrative he could not have predicted, the weight of responsibility mingling with quiet pride. And as the group led him through the park toward the edge of the city, Jamal's eyes remained attentive, ears alert to the subtle sounds around him, fully aware that the events of last night were only the beginning of what was to come. The group led Jamal through the quiet streets, the rhythm of their steps blending with the distant hum of traffic and the soft chirping of birds beginning their morning songs, while sunlight filtered through the high buildings and cast long warm streaks across wet sidewalks. Jamal felt the weight of each step, a mixture of curiosity and anticipation settling into his chest as he noticed the precise, almost ceremonial way the figures moved around him, their coordinated movements creating a subtle energy that seemed to reverberate through the city block itself. The leader glanced over his shoulder and gestured for Jamal to continue forward, and the boy complied, shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of his backpack, eyes taking in every detail. The sheen of rain on the street, the scattered leaves moving with the breeze, the faint reflections of light on puddles that highlighted the contours of the asphalt. As they approached a nondescript building at the corner, Jamal noticed the careful attention to the surroundings by the group, their gazes sweeping the street, ensuring every angle was observed, every sound noted, a silent vigilance that impressed upon him the seriousness of the situation. The leader opened the door and gestured for Jamal to enter first, a quiet acknowledgement of his role in the events that had unfolded the night before, and the boy stepped inside cautiously, feeling the sudden shift in temperature as the warmth of the interior met the cool morning air. Inside, the space was minimalistic yet orderly, the faint scent of polished wood and fresh coffee mingling with the soft hum of computers in the background, and Jamal could feel the presence of authority in the careful placement of furniture and the deliberate quiet of the staff moving through the room. He followed the leader to a central area where a large map was displayed on the wall, dotted with markers and annotations, and the attention of the group turned briefly to the screen, their eyes scanning details with the precision of people accustomed to planning and execution. Jamal glanced around, noticing the subtle exchange of glances, the quiet nods, and the way information moved seamlessly between them, and he felt a mixture of awe and calm, recognizing that the significance of his actions had extended far beyond what he had imagined. The leader approached him again, crouching slightly to meet his height and speak in a tone that was both firm and kind. "We want to understand exactly what happened," he said, his eyes searching Jamal's for any hint of omission or exaggeration, and Jamal recounted the events with careful honesty, describing each movement, each gesture, the constant vigilance, and the quiet assurance he had maintained through the night. The leader listened intently, occasionally nodding, his expression shifting subtly with every detail, reflecting a growing respect for the young boy who had acted without hesitation, without expectation, simply because it was the right thing to do. As Jamal finished, there was a pause, filled only by the soft click of computer keys and the distant city sounds filtering through the windows, and the leader leaned back slightly, exhaling softly, a faint smile appearing as if he had reached a silent conclusion. "You did what most adults would not," he said quietly, letting the words settle between them, and Jamal felt a warmth rise in his chest, a quiet acknowledgement that his choice, his courage, had been recognized by those who understood the value of such an act. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, reflecting off glass windows and damp sidewalks, casting long shadows that stretched across the streets, while inside, the subtle vibrations of purpose and authority surrounded Jamal, reinforcing the sense that the night's events had created a bridge between his small world and something far larger, something that would resonate beyond the alley where it had all begun. And as he stood there, absorbing the weight and significance of the moment, he understood that the path ahead was already being shaped by the quiet courage he had shown. The sound of the street outside grew quieter as Jamal and the group moved through the narrow corridor of the building, their footsteps careful and deliberate against the polished concrete floors, echoing softly in the still morning air. Sunlight spilled through high windows, casting long angled shadows that stretched across the walls and reflected off the smooth surfaces of metal tables and monitors, painting the space with a warm, diffused glow. Jamal followed closely, backpack snug against his shoulders, heart steady but alert, taking in the details around him. The subtle hum of computers, the faint scent of fresh coffee mixed with the cool aroma of the building's ventilation, and the soft, precise movements of the figures around him who navigated the space with an air of discipline and quiet authority. The leader paused at a large wall display, a digital map with moving markers, and Jamal saw for the first time the scope of their operation. Routes, locations, and points of interest highlighted with precision. A man beside the display tapped on the screen, zooming in on one particular point, and the leader's gaze shifted to Jamal. "This is where he was found," the man said softly, the words deliberate, measured, as if every syllable had weight. Jamal glanced at the screen, seeing the alley, the exact spot where he had spent the night keeping watch, and a strange warmth filled him, a sense of validation mingled with humility. The leader motioned for him to step closer. "We need to understand everything you saw, everything you did, and everything you knew about that location." Jamal nodded, his voice calm but certain. "I stayed there the whole night. I made sure he was breathing, kept him warm, and did not leave until the ambulance came." The leader studied him, tilting his head slightly, as though measuring the truth behind the words. Jamal felt the weight of their attention, the scrutiny that came not from skepticism but from respect, and he held himself still, knowing that honesty was the only thing required of him. One of the figures handed a tablet to the leader, who scrolled through notes and images briefly before setting it aside, his eyes returning to Jamal. "Did you notice anything unusual that night? Anything that stood out?" Jamal thought carefully, remembering the faint glint of a watch on the man's wrist, the rhythmic drip of rain from the gutter, the soft hum of distant traffic that had seemed to fade in the alley, leaving only the sound of life between him and the man. The alley was quiet except for the rain and distant cars. "There was a watch on his wrist, a small detail, but it caught the light," he said, voice steady. The leader nodded slightly. "It is those details that help us understand the situation. Most would have overlooked them, but you observed." A soft smile touched Jamal's lips, unspoken pride mixing with the quiet realization that his attention and care had meaning beyond the simple act of helping. Outside, the sunlight grew warmer, flooding the room with clarity and soft shadows, illuminating the group as they moved to check other monitors and stations, each member operating with precision, yet leaving Jamal space to absorb the gravity of the morning. The leader turned to the group briefly, then back to Jamal. "You acted without expectation, without reward, simply because it was right. That is rare." Jamal nodded, the words settling within him, reinforcing the quiet certainty that his choices mattered, that courage and kindness could ripple far beyond a single night in a small alley. The hum of computers, the faint clicking of keyboards, and the soft movements of the disciplined team around him became the backdrop for a profound understanding that the events of last night had connected him to something larger, something deliberate and far-reaching, and that the recognition he received now was not for fame or reward, but for the integrity he had shown when it mattered most. Each moment in that room, each glance, each gesture, reinforced the unspoken lesson that even the smallest acts of vigilance and care could reverberate with consequence, bridging the space between unnoticed courage and meaningful impact. And as Jamal stood quietly absorbing it all, he realized that the journey he had begun in the rain-soaked alley was far from over, but that he was exactly where he was meant to be, fully seen for the first time. The room grew quieter as the leader stepped away from the wall display and walked toward a large window overlooking the city skyline, where sunlight reflected off glass towers and damp streets below, turning the entire landscape into a mosaic of gold and silver. Jamal remained near the center of the room, hands resting on the straps of his backpack, while the other men exchanged brief glances and silent nods that suggested a decision had already been made. The faint aroma of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of polished wood and electronics, and for a moment the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic filtering through the insulated glass, and the soft clicking of a keyboard somewhere in the background. The leader finally turned back toward Jamal and folded his arms. His expression had changed. The professional distance was still there, but something warmer had appeared beneath it. "Respect. There is something you should know," he said. Jamal listened carefully. The man took a slow breath before continuing. "The person you helped is Commander Ethan Walker." The name meant nothing to Jamal at first. He simply blinked and waited. The leader nodded as though he had expected that reaction. Most people would not recognize the name. Commander Walker never cared about publicity. He glanced toward several members of the group. But among us, he is considered a legend. The room fell completely silent. One of the men lowered his eyes briefly, almost as if remembering something personal. Another stood a little straighter. The leader continued. For more than 2 decades he served this country in ways most people will never fully know. He trained leaders. He led difficult missions. He brought people home when others thought it was impossible. Jamal noticed the subtle emotion in their faces. Not admiration born from fame. Something deeper. Loyalty. Gratitude. Brotherhood. The kind that survives years. The leader walked toward a nearby table and picked up a framed photograph. He handed it to Jamal carefully. In the picture, a younger Ethan Walker stood surrounded by a team of men wearing matching uniforms. Their faces were smiling despite the harsh environment around them. Dust covered their boots. The sun burned brightly behind them. Yet every face carried the same unmistakable expression of trust. Jamal studied the photograph quietly. They all knew him, he asked. Every one of them, the leader replied. Some of us are in that picture. Jamal looked up surprised. The leader smiled faintly. I was younger then. A few quiet chuckles spread through the room. The tension eased for a moment. Then the leader's expression grew serious again. Last night changed everything. Jamal looked confused. Sir. The man stepped closer. Doctors told us that if help had arrived even a little later, the outcome could have been very different. Jamal stared at him silently. Outside the window, a flock of birds crossed the bright morning sky, their shadows passing briefly across nearby buildings before disappearing into the distance. The leader followed Jamal's gaze for a second before speaking. Again, Commander Walker is alive because someone stopped when everyone else kept walking. The words landed heavily. Jamal lowered his eyes toward the photograph in his hands. He remembered the rain, the cold pavement, the empty street, the blanket, the hours spent listening to a stranger breathe. None of it had felt extraordinary at the time. It had simply felt necessary. The leader seemed to sense exactly what he was thinking. You still do not understand, do you? Jamal looked up. Understand what? The man smiled gently. You think you helped a stranger. He paused. The entire room watched quietly. To us, you help someone we consider family. For several seconds nobody spoke. Sunlight continued pouring through the windows, illuminating floating particles of dust in the air and casting long beams across the floor. The city moved outside. Cars traveled below. People hurried to work. Yet inside that room time seemed suspended. Jamal felt something tighten in his chest. Not pride. Not excitement. Something closer to belonging. For the first time in years he did not feel invisible. He did not feel forgotten. He felt seen. And judging by the expression surrounding him, this story was about to become even more personal than anyone expected. The silence lingered long after the leader finished speaking, settling across the room like morning light across still water, and Jamal found himself staring once more at the photograph in his hands. The faces in the frame seemed different now. They were no longer strangers frozen in time. They were people connected by loyalty, sacrifice, and years of shared purpose. Carefully, he handed the photograph back. The leader accepted it and placed it on the table before glancing toward one of the men standing near a computer station. A subtle nod passed between them. The man reached into a folder and removed a worn document protected inside a clear sleeve. He carried it across the room and handed it to the leader, who studied it for a moment before looking back at Jamal. There is one more thing, he said quietly. Something in his tone caused the entire room to become still again. Jamal noticed several of the men exchange brief glances. Whatever came next mattered. The leader stepped closer and held out the document. Do you recognize this name? Jamal lowered his eyes. At first, he only saw faded letters and an old photograph attached to a military record. Then his breath caught. His fingers tightened slightly. He knew that face. He had seen it many times before. Not in photographs hanging on walls. Not in newspapers. In a small worn picture he carried inside his backpack. a picture he kept folded between the pages of an old notebook. The name beneath the image read Marcus Carter. Jamal looked up slowly. "That is my father." The room fell completely silent. Even the faint clicking of keyboards seemed to stop. The leader nodded. "We thought so." Jamal stared at him. His father had died when he was very young. Most of what he knew came from stories his mother used to tell on difficult nights. Stories about a man who always helped people. A man who believed character mattered more than money. A man who never walked away when someone needed help. Jamal swallowed hard. "How do you know my father?" The leader smiled softly. Not the smile of a professional. The smile of someone remembering a friend. "Because he saved my life." Jamal froze. For several seconds he could not speak. The leader walked toward the window and looked out across the city. Sunlight reflected off the glass buildings outside, flooding the room with a warm glow. "Many years ago," he said quietly, "your father and Commander Walker served together." Jamal listened carefully. "There was a difficult operation. Things went wrong. Your father had an opportunity to think only about himself." The man paused briefly. "He did not." Emotion flickered across several faces around the room. One man lowered his eyes. Another stared silently at the floor. The leader turned back toward Jamal. "Because of the choice your father made, several people returned home to their families." Jamal felt his chest tighten. The room suddenly seemed smaller, warmer, more personal. "Commander Walker never forgot him," the leader continued. "None of us did." He reached into his pocket and carefully removed a small silver coin worn smooth from years of handling. "Your father carried this." Jamal recognized it immediately. His mother had described it dozens of times. The coin she thought had been lost forever. The leader placed it gently into Jamal's hand. The metal felt cool against his skin. For a moment he could not speak. He simply stared at it while sunlight danced across its surface. "Last night," the leader said softly, "a son made the same choice his father once made." Jamal lowered his head. The coin rested quietly in his palm. Around him nobody spoke. They did not need to. Because for the first time the events of the last 24 hours made sense. He had thought he was helping a stranger. But somehow, without realizing it, he had completed a circle that had started long before he was born. 1 year later, the spring sunlight poured across the red brick buildings of Jefferson High School, warming the sidewalks and turning the freshly cut grass into a sea of bright green beneath a cloudless sky. Families filled the rows of folding chairs arranged across the football field, their conversations blending into a gentle hum that drifted through the afternoon air. Jamal stood near the edge of the graduation line, adjusting the collar of his gown as a light breeze moved across the field. The silver coin rested safely in his pocket, its familiar weight grounding him the way it had every day for the past year. He could still remember the cold rain, the empty alley, and the stranger he had refused to leave behind. Yet standing there now, surrounded by classmates and teachers, the memory felt less like a distant night and more like the first page of a completely different life. His name was called and applause rolled across the field. Jamal stepped forward, sunlight reflecting from the stage as he crossed it with steady confidence. The principal handed him his diploma, and for a brief moment the entire crowd blurred into a sea of colors and faces. Then he saw them. Near the front row sat Commander Ethan Walker, healthy once again, wearing a simple dark suit. Beside him were the men who had appeared in the park that morning months ago. Some had traveled from different states just to be there. None of them were dressed for attention. They sat quietly smiling, watching. Jamal felt emotion rise unexpectedly in his chest. He accepted the diploma and stepped down from the stage, hearing the cheers continue behind him. Later, as graduates tossed their caps into the bright afternoon sky, Ethan approached him. The older man moved slowly but confidently, the sunlight catching the silver in his hair. For a second neither spoke. The noise of celebration faded into the background. Ethan simply looked at him with a warmth that needed no explanation. "Your father would be proud of you," he said softly. Jamal lowered his eyes for a moment. He had imagined hearing those words his entire life. Not from a stranger. Not from someone who barely knew him. But from someone who had known the man he had spent years trying to remember. Ethan reached into his pocket and handed him a small photograph. Jamal recognized it immediately. It was another picture of the old team. His father stood near the center, smiling beneath the bright desert sun. On the back, written in faded ink, were 4 simple words. Always choose the right path. Jamal ran his thumb gently across the handwriting. Around them, families laughed, cameras flashed, and graduates embraced one another beneath the golden afternoon light. Yet for a moment the world felt perfectly still. Ethan placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. You already have. Neither man said anything else. They did not need to. As the celebration continued, Jamal slipped the photograph carefully beside the silver coin and looked toward the horizon beyond the football field. The future stretched before him, uncertain but full of possibility. For years he had believed he was invisible, forgotten, alone. But kindness had changed that. Not because it brought attention, not because it brought recognition, because it revealed who he already was. The same quiet strength that once lived in his father now lived in him. The sunlight softened as the afternoon drifted toward evening, casting long golden shadows across the field while laughter echoed through the warm air. Jamal stood there for a moment longer, breathing deeply, feeling the coin in his pocket, and the photograph against his chest. He had not changed the entire world, but he had changed one life. And in doing so, he had unknowingly completed a promise that had begun long before he was born.